Well, the 2024 season is officially in the books, and so is our Dynasty ranking series. We finish it off with the tight end rankings on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down, and welcome to the last in our series of Dynasty ranking videos. If you haven't already, you can go back and check out our rankings for the quarterbacks, the running backs, and the wide receivers. Plus, if you just want to look at the rankings, head over to ffdfantasyfootball.com and you'll find them all there. If you've got any questions, leave them below in the comments, or you can hit us up on Instagram at Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Be great if you could like and subscribe as well. Let's get into things for our tight end rankings, though. And we're going to start things off, as we always do, with the top 10. And for me, I think this is pretty obvious. It's Brock Bowers. Now, to be fair, he was in my top 10 last season anyway. I was always confident he was going to be good. In fact, he was my number 2 Dynasty tight end last season. I was the highest of anyone I saw in the industry going into last season, and he absolutely paid off. He's going to be an absolute stud moving forward. Definitely the number 1 pick in Dynasty. In some leagues, even belongs in the first round because tight ends do have a long shelf life. There is a little bit of competition for him, but realistically, surprisingly little. At number 2, I've got Trey McBride, who was impressively consistent. Once again, another tight end 8 finish. That's still not fantastic, but it's a lack of touchdowns, that is absolutely killing him. Really struggled to find the end zone. Just in general, he's got 9 touchdowns in his 3 seasons so far. That's very low for a tight end, and we know that in general, tight ends make most of their money in the red zone. So despite going well over 1,000 yards, he needs to be a little bit better if he's truly going to pay off, but he's so consistent. We know the talent's there, so he's still my number 2. Not far behind him, once again, it's Sam Laporta. He had a bit of a drop back last season. Definitely got a lot fewer receptions. Was a little bit more efficient with them. Was getting them a little bit more downfield. Was also getting some less red zone action, which really hurt him. But he did start to get hot later in the season, so that really helped. So he drops down to number 3, but he's still a very good pickup. Very talented tight end. Especially in that team, he is going to produce for the long term. TJ Hawkinson back at number 4 after getting right after his injury. Still didn't look great towards the end of last year, but can't argue that he's certainly going to be good moving forward. Still relatively young, got a lot of time ahead of him, so I feel pretty good about Hawk as well. Mark Andrews had a very slow start to the season. A lot of concerns about Isaiah Likely, but Andrews started to get hot later in the year and ended up with most touchdowns ever. Oddly enough, also, just the second time he's ever played 17 games in the season. He did play 16 in 2018, which was technically a full season, but he's had 4 injury-affected seasons, so it's nice to see him at least stay healthy and also get the ball very deep downfield once again. That certainly helped, but he does need to work on his per-game efficiency to be good for fantasy. And I guess also for the Ravens a little bit, though, with how they used him when they were way ahead, they often just used him to block anyway. George Kittle remains in there at number 6. I know he's getting a little bit older, but he had his 2nd highest yardage season ever, and that was in his 8th season. So very impressive. Plus also had 8 touchdowns, which is his 2nd highest as well. So a very positive season for Kittle, despite missing a couple of games. In fact, he hasn't had a fully healthy season since 2018 either. Now, he did get some benefits from a lack of Debo and Ayuk at times, and CMC being out, I think, also really helped. So it is worth keeping that in mind. He is also a lot older than a lot of the other tight end options. He has been playing for 8 seasons now. David Njoku is someone I still like moving forward. If they get a proper quarterback, he could be very useful. He only played 11 games last season, which really hurt, and he didn't look fully healthy for a lot of them. Still doesn't really get into the end zone as much as we'd hope. They do tend to use guys like Jordan Akins, and even Whiteheart occasionally. in the red zone when they could be using Njoku. It's just not his major role, and that's always going to hurt him for fantasy, but especially in PPR, he is a good, solid option, despite the fact he's entering his 9th season. Pat Frymouth is someone that I was high on early in the season, then I really dropped off with how they were using him, but he did kind of come good later in the season. Ended up with his second biggest receiving season. And a solid amount of touchdowns as well. But he has to be a lot better to be productive for fantasy. I do think because he's still young, because he might potentially be getting a young, fresh quarterback coming in, we know that can often lead to good tight end production. Plus, realistically, they're wide receivers. Even if they get another guy in, I do still think Frymouth's going to be a top 3 option. Dalton Kincaid is in at 9. He was disappointing. They used Knox way too much for it to be effective. Plus, they just spread the wide receivers in a really weird way. So he had a big drop-off in production. Also, missing games due to injury didn't help. But he also isn't getting enough touchdowns either. So there's a lot of cause for concern for Kincaid, despite his obvious talents as a former first-rounder. Dallas Goedert is a guy that I've liked for a long time, but he has been around for a while now, and we know, honestly, he's ultimately going to be relatively limited. Only played 10 games during the season, but his last fully healthy season, also 2018, apparently a great season for staying healthy as a top tight end. But once again, 5 or fewer touchdowns every year since his debut. This is his 7th season now as well, but this was a very low yardage season for him. Did hurt that he played his fewest games ever. I do think he's still going to step up. There isn't anyone behind him I particularly love either, which I think makes a big difference. Jonnu Smith's kind of bounced around a little bit. He seems to have found a home in Miami, but it's hard to really trust this is going to be a long-term thing. He's also entering his 9th season. This has been his best for yardage by an absolute mile, and for receptions, and his second highest for touchdowns. But you have to feel like things are going to change a little bit there. He can't remain in that role the same way he was last season. So for that reason, I've got him ranked a little bit lower than most. After him in 12th is Kyle Pitts. This is purely on talent. At some point, you have to think that maybe something changes. He has at least had an increase in his number of touchdowns every season, from 1 in season 1 to 4 in season 4. In fact, the number of touchdowns is the number of his season, which is absolutely crazy. Look, he's been so disappointing for so long. It is really hurt by the fact that he can't block very effectively. They have been using Charlie Werner a lot as a blocker because he's one of the best blocking tight ends in the league, and Kyle Pitts has been one of the worst. Still a real receiving weapon, but if you're not out there for blocking, then you're not going to be out there to run routes when something changes, and that really hurts his production, and is why he can't be any higher than that, despite the fact his production really wasn't that different from last season. Directly after him, Cade Otton. Again, he's just naturally limited by the amount of weapons around him. Very talented player, and we had seen that he could produce when there wanted a lot of wide receivers around him, but that offense runs through the wide receivers. Early on in the season, it was Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Then it was Jalen McMillan later on in the season. Otton honestly was only involved when there were no other options at all. So I do think that Otton honestly can't be higher than this, even though he's going to remain a guy who's playing most downs most weeks for years to come. Evan Ingram is more of an aging issue. He has been around for 8 seasons and he's struggling to stay healthy. He did have a couple of healthy years in a row after being really iffy early in his career, but got injured partway through last season. That really hurt. I do think he can bounce back, but Jacksonville is really working to get a lot of wide receivers in there. We saw that this season. That will probably happen in the coming season as well, and that's going to hurt Ingram. Plus, his age is a disadvantage as well. Not everyone can be Travis Kelce playing until well into his mid-30s. That's just not realistic for most players. He's naturally had a big drop-off. They don't really use him a lot in the red zone. They used to scheme him up there. Actually got plenty of receptions. Got more receptions in the most recent season than the season before. And in fact, 2021 as well. In fact, his 4th highest receiving season from a reception perspective, but his lowest yardage ever. They're just using him in different ways. The offense did really struggle. The offensive line was the biggest issue there. I think if they fix that up, it is going to help Kelce. But realistically, I feel like he's kind of on his way out the door at this stage. I think while the team is still good, he's going to keep fighting for another ring. But as soon as things drop off, I would expect to see him gone. Tucker Kraft was surprisingly good last season, but it was really on the back of a lot of extraordinary efficiency. 7 touchdowns, which didn't seem realistic based on how many looks he was getting. only 50 receptions, but over 700 yards, which is a wacky ratio, going at over 14 yards a reception. That is not sustainable at all. I don't know how they're going to continue using him and the wide receivers, but they don't really even throw the ball enough to sustain all those guys. Kraft just gets by on extreme efficiency, and that is not something I like to rely on. Hunter Henry has been very up and down the last few years, but he did have another positive season this season. 97 targets is actually most of his career, and he's now entering his 10th season. It wasn't very efficient with them, and he only had 2 touchdowns, which is tied for a career low. So there is reason for concern there, but there's also reason for optimism. If they get a better I think just better players around him, he is going to be able to be more efficient, but then he's going to drop in targets. So you got to kind of take the payoff there. For that reason, I've got him ranked pretty low, that and his age, of course. Isaiah Likely, I feel like still has the potential to be a good receiving tight end. He just needs either Andrews to move on or he needs to move on. Something needs to change because he is clearly capable of pulling off good big games when they choose to use him. This was his best season to date, but even so, it was once again frustrating. He's not really being used the way that we hoped he would, especially when Andrews is injured. Jake Ferguson, disappointing again. I did think he was going to have a big season. Instead, he got no touchdowns, couldn't get over 500 yards, got plenty of targets and was going at like 8 yards a reception, which is extraordinarily poor. Doesn't help that Dak was out for a lot of that and the O-line was really banged up and just bad, frankly. But it doesn't make me feel good about Ferguson in the long term, especially for Dynasty. Noah Fant, another player who has been quite disappointing, just hasn't been used the way you would hope as a fantasy manager. 1 touchdown in the last 2 seasons combined is ridiculous because I'm pretty sure Pharaoh Brown has more than that just this season. He's not even the number 2 tight end. So it is pretty wacky, being used very inefficiently, but that's always been the case. Realistically, the talent might be there, but not as much as they hoped originally when he was drafted in the top 20 odd originally. So he has to step up a little bit if he's going to hang around in a starting role. I'm not convinced that's going to happen. Another guy a little bit under threat is Dalton Schultz. Cade Stover is obviously getting a little bit better. The injury has hurt him recently. Schultz had 3 really good seasons in a row, was top 10 in all 3 of them. Despite being unhealthy at times, but they really brought in a lot of wide receivers, and all of a sudden he's gone back to before he was not a starter. This is his fewest targets and his fewest yards and his fewest touchdowns in his 5 starting seasons, despite the fact he played the most games. Realistically, they just stopped using him the way they used to. He's never been a guy who makes big plays, but he used to get at least a reasonable amount of receptions and a whole heap of red zone looks. That didn't happen this season. That really limits his upside, even though at the moment he's at least a clear starter and someone with a history of good production. I really struggle to trust Jatavian Sanders. The main issue I have is they seem to keep wanting to use Tommy Tremble whenever he's healthy. And he hasn't been healthy a lot, but it's been enough that it's really affected Sanders. Even later on the season, they were still using them in a bit of a committee split. Sanders is the better player. He was someone I really liked as a rookie at the start of last year. Didn't quite work out that way, but I do feel like there's still upside there. Another guy with upside is Eric All. The injury has really hurt him. He looked really good at times last season, but it's going to be hard for him to emerge when Mike Gesicki has looked so good. I do think the talent's there, though. This is very much an upside pick. If you're going for all, you're going for upside, there's a real possibility nothing happens. But especially if you're rebuilding, he's the kind of guy you can stash for pretty cheap. Another guy worth stashing is Chig Okonkwo. The problem is he was actually pretty good towards the end of last season, but he has been generally disappointing. 3 seasons with 6 touchdowns, and he's pretty much been the starting tight end the whole time. That's pretty mediocre. He's never had fantastic yardage, and he's been going under 10 yards a reception the last 2 seasons. In fact, it dropped off even more this season, despite 1 massive play. So I am concerned about him, but there is clearly some upside, and that's why I'm willing to take a risk on him for the right price. On the other hand, a player that's the total opposite of that, Tyler Higbee, kind of just finishing off his career. I don't think there's a lot of long-term upside here, but realistically, at this stage, still could potentially produce for a season or 2. He's never been a big touchdown getter, never had more than 5 touchdowns in the season, but he does have a couple of top 10 seasons. There is upside here. We saw he looked good in the few games he played back. Maybe he can continue that. We'll have to wait and see. Taysom Hill, obviously not truly a tight end and battled an injury last season, but we've seen that he can be pretty good when given the opportunity. Obviously, rushing is his main thing and leads to a lot of touchdowns. Only had 6 last season, but he only played 8 games. And he'd only had 1 season under 16 games in the previous 7. So I do think you have to take that into account. If he can stay healthy and keeps getting used, he's going to be able to produce, but he's getting on a bit. And I don't think that's going to keep happening long term. Cole Kmet, very disappointing in general. The way he was used last season, he had a big drop off, but there is new coaching staff coming in, so you just don't know what's going to happen. The problem is they've got so many good receivers. He is just always likely to be an afterthought, and he has played disappointingly at times as well. So I can't rank him higher than this, despite 2 top 12 seasons in the previous 2 seasons. It does seem to me that Theo Johnson is going to be the guy for the Giants if he can get healthy again. He didn't look great last season, despite getting used pretty effectively, but nobody did in New York. So there's always the possibility that something comes in, changes get made, whether it's a new rookie quarterback or they bring in a vet, I don't know. But something could change, and all of a sudden you've got a situation where Johnson is effective. That starting role has some value. Mike Gesicki, it's hard to tell whether he's going to keep that role. He's now entering his 8th season. He's not young. But we have seen him produce. He has 2 top 10 seasons to his name. Didn't get enough touchdowns last season, which really hurt, but was getting big yardage, 2nd most receptions, 3rd most receiving yards. That's pretty solid. That's pretty solid numbers. I do feel like there's upside there for Gesicki moving forward, but it's limited by his age. We don't really know what's going to happen with him. And finally, another Noah down in the bottom of these lists. Noah Gray. Look, if Travis Kelce's gone, maybe Gray takes over. This was his best season. He's just finished his 4th season. He had doubled the total amount of touchdowns he'd had. Most yardage, his most yards per reception, most targets, most receptions. Everything was a high. It does seem like they're transitioning to him a little bit for Kelce, but it's hard to really trust that moving forward. And that's all we have for our tight end rankings. If you want to go deeper, you can check them out on our website. A couple of guys worth mentioning that might be around in leagues, guys like Will Disley, for example. A little bit risky because I do feel like they're going to bring in someone else, but he was nominally their starter, even though he's getting older. Tyler Conklin, same thing, wasn't particularly good, is getting older as well. You'd have to feel like with Aaron Rodgers no longer there, that news came out recently, that they might try to get younger in general. Juwan Johnson, again, not even the clear starter, wasn't particularly good. Zach Ertz was good when given the opportunity, but he's getting on and he's a free agent. I don't see that happening. And then there's some youngsters coming through. Guys like Jeremy Ruckett might take over from Conklin. AJ Barner might take over from Noah Fant, or at least be involved as a good backup. Ben Sinnott, potentially the new Washington starter over there. So there is some talent there. Even guys like Michael Mayer, who was drafted early, but now sits behind Brock Bowers. It is possible that he ends up somewhere else. Cade Stover might take over from Schultz. We saw Austin Hooper get some good chances in New England. Potentially something happens there. So, look, there's plenty of talent around, but that is my top 30. As always, if you've got any questions, make sure you ask them in the comments, or you can hit me up on Instagram or Twitter. Website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. Also got my latest NFL mock draft over there. I will be bringing out another one of those very soon as well, as we are hitting draft season officially now. Plus, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. I look forward to chatting to you guys next time on the Fantasy First Down.